Topic 8. Growth and development of Hong Kong up to the late 19th century. History GPS. Changes and development of Hong Kong under colonial rule. When Britain took control of Hong Kong Island through signing an equal treaty with China in 1842, agriculture, small-scale handicrafts industry, and commercial activities had already been developed in the Hong Kong region. Britain declared Hong Kong a free port and introduced Western-style administration and policies. The political, economic, and social development of Hong Kong had changed dramatically since then. At the same time, social problems increased with the growth of population. The government, local Chinese, and foreign organizations took corresponding measures or provided various services. They improved people's livelihood and facilitate the development of Hong Kong. Topic Inquiry. What impact did the British colonial rule and different local organizations have on the development of Hong Kong up to the late 19th century? 1. Hong Kong before British rule. Before coming under British rule, Hong Kong was not well known internationally. Chinese in Hong Kong maintained the traditional way of life, i.e., farmed and fished for a living. 2. Transformation of Hong Kong under British rule. After 1842, Hong Kong rapidly developed into an international entrepot. Foreign population grew continuously as well. Western-style administration, commerce, and education were imported to Hong Kong. 3. Rise of Chinese leaders and non-governmental organizations. During the early years of British rule, local Chinese had low social status. In the late 19th century, some Chinese leaders rose, acting as a bridge of communication between local Chinese and the government. Together with the efforts of other foreigners, different non-governmental organizations were formed, contributing to the progress of Hong Kong in education and medical care. History Starter. 1. Before 1842, Hong Kong had a small population. Fishing, farming, and running local markets, called bazaars, were common economic activities at the time. 2. Between 1841 and 1898, China was forced to cede Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula and lease the new territories to Britain for 99 years. 3. In the late 19th century. In the past, there were only small fishing boats. Today, they have been replaced by big foreign merchant ships engaging in entrepot trade. 4. Yes, Hong Kong has a good harbor. It would be a waste just to develop fishing. Our predecessors had the foresight to develop it into a free port. Today, we have a prosperous entrepot. 5. Yet they did not expect that some Chinese merchants engaging in entrepot trade became rich and influential. I have to change the policies towards the Chinese. 6. Not only merchants. As some Chinese have received Western education and became professionals, I will also appoint them as counselors. They will be the bridge of communication between the Chinese community and us. 7. Still, the British were the rulers of Hong Kong. Apart from a few Chinese elites, most local Chinese in the late 19th century were still not treated equally. They had a low social status. A. Establishment of British colonial rule. Guiding questions. How did Britain establish its rule in Hong Kong? How did the British systems and policies affect the development of Hong Kong? 1. Hong Kong coming under British rule. From 1842 to 1997, Britain obtained Hong Kong from China and ruled the place as a base for expanding its trading interest in China. A. Cession of Hong Kong Island. After China was defeated in the First Opium War between 1840 to 1842 and signed the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain, marking the start of British rule over Hong Kong. B. Cession of the Kowloon Peninsula. China was again defeated in the Second Opium War between 1856 to 1860. In 1860, China signed the Convention of Beijing, which ceded the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain. At that time, the Kowloon Peninsula referred to the area south of Boundary Street and Stonecutters Island. C. Lease of the New Territories. In 1898, Britain forced China to sign the Convention respecting an extension of Hong Kong territory. Britain leased the area north of Boundary Street and south of the Shenzhen River and the surrounding islands for 99 years. The British called the newly acquired land the New Territories. Britain then established its control over the entire Hong Kong and ruled it until 1997. Source 8.1 shows Chinese and British officials marking the boundary between the New Territories and Guangdong in 1898. 2. Establishment of British colonial rule. A. Establishment of government structure and institutions. According to the Letters Patent and Royal Instructions in 1843, Britain established the government structure and institutions of Hong Kong. 1. The Governor and Principal Officials. The Governor. According to the Letters Patent, the Governor of Hong Kong was the representative of the British monarch in ruling Hong Kong. He was also the head of the Hong Kong government. Other principal officials. The Colonial Secretary, later known as Chief Secretary, headed all executive departments and the civil servants. The Colonial Treasurer, later known as Financial Secretary, was responsible for making budgets and other financial matters. The Attorney General drafted laws and handled prosecutions. The Secretary for Chinese Affairs was responsible for managing Chinese affairs. Source 8.2 is a picture of Pottinger, a British representative in signing the Treaty of Nanjing, who was later appointed as Hong Kong's first governor. History decoded. Letters Patent and Royal Instructions. The Letters Patent and Royal Instructions were both issued by Queen Victoria in 1843. Besides declaring the position of the governor, the Letters Patent also stated the powers of the governor and the government structure of Hong Kong. The Royal Instructions stated the roles of the governor, the Executive Council and Legislative Council, and the relationship between them. The Letters Patent and Royal Instructions established Hong Kong's political system, which largely remained unchanged until the 1980s. 2. The Executive Council and Legislative Council. The Executive Council and Legislative Council were set up according to the Royal Instructions. They were advisory bodies to the governor. The former advised the governor on policy making and drafted bills. The latter was responsible for examining laws and public spending. All members of the two councils were appointed by the governor. They were divided into official members or government officials and unofficial members or social elites. In the early years of British rule, all councillors were official members. The Legislative Council and Executive Council first appointed unofficial members in 1850 and 1896 respectively. 3. The Judiciary. Hong Kong adopted the British judicial system, which emphasized fair trial, right of appeal, and verdicts reached in accordance with laws. In 1844, the highest judiciary, the Supreme Court of Hong Kong, was established. It made judgments according to Hong Kong's laws and decided on whether local ordinances were consistent with British laws or the Letters Patent. History Extra. Unsolved case of poisoned bread. In the 1850s, Yi Sing Bakery, founded by local businessman Cheung Pui Lin, supplied most of the bread for Hong Kong's foreign residents. On January 15, 1857, hundreds of foreigners were poisoned after eating the bread from Yi Sing Bakery. When Cheung Pui Lin was put on trial, he claimed that he had no reason for poisoning people as his business was thriving. The jury's 5-1 verdict of not guilty reflected judicial fairness in Hong Kong. However, this failed to pacify the foreigners. Under their pressure, the government eventually exiled Cheung Pui Lin. Source 8.3 is an illustration of Yi Sing Bakery in a British newspaper. B. Features of early British administration. 1. Governance under supervision of British government. The ruling power of the Hong Kong government was authorized by Britain. The governor and other principal officials were appointed by the Colonial Office of Britain. The Hong Kong government had to obey the British government. For example, the British government had the power to amend, abolish, or make the laws of Hong Kong. The governor had to ask for its instructions in case of major issues and report his duty regularly. The British government also took full charge of Hong Kong's diplomatic and military affairs. 2. Great power of the governor. The governor enjoyed great autonomy within areas regulated by the British government. He was the chairman of the Executive Council and Legislative Council and had the final decision on bills. As long as his governance did not violate British national policy, he could handle local executive, economic, and social affairs independently. The governor also enjoyed certain judicial powers, including pardoning criminals and reducing penalties. In times of emergency, he could command the British troops stationed in Hong Kong. Source 8.4 is a picture of the present-day Government House. It is located on the Upper Albert Road and was constructed in 1851 as the official residence of the governor. 3. Full implementation of the appointment system. The governor and other principal officials were all appointed by the British government. The appointment system also applied to the Executive Council and Legislative Council. In the early years of British rule, all members of the two councils were appointed by the governor. Official members in both councils might even overlap. This helped ensure the smooth passage of bills and governmental measures. 4. British-dominated government. High-ranking officials of the Hong Kong government and members of the Executive Council and Legislative Council were mostly British. Early unofficial members were mainly British merchants as well. Other Europeans and Chinese were in the minority. In short, the early governance of Hong Kong was almost monopolized by the British. C. Significance for the development of Hong Kong's governance. Britain introduced Western executive and legislative systems into Hong Kong. This modernized Hong Kong's governance and gradually strengthened its connection to the international community. 1. Establishing the prototype of governmental structure. From 1843 onward, the Hong Kong government, with the governor as head, was run by different levels of departments and officials. Besides, the Executive Council assisted the governor in policy making, and the Legislative Council was responsible for examining laws. These established the prototype of Hong Kong's governmental structure. 2. Laying the foundations for the rule of law. The Supreme Court of Hong Kong was an independent judicial organ. The dismissal of the Chief Justice had to be approved by the Privy Council of Britain. To ensure a fair trial, the jury, independent from the judges, was established. These measures laid the foundations for the rule of law of modern Hong Kong. Source 8.5 is a photograph of Governor Robinson and the legislative councillors in the late 1890s. Most councillors were British. Source 8.6 shows the government structure of Hong Kong in the late 19th century. B. Economic and social conditions. Guiding questions. What were the social and economic establishments in Hong Kong by the end of the 19th century? In the meantime, what were the major social and hygienic issues? What were the government's solutions? What policies did the Hong Kong government adopt towards the Chinese? 1. Economic development. A. Establishment of free port policy. Hong Kong has a deep harbor and is the main gate to southern China. Britain declared Hong Kong a free port to develop entrepot trade in 1841. Under the free port policy, merchant ships could enter and leave the port of Hong Kong without having to pay any harbor dues. B. Rise and development of entrepot trade. 1. Rise of entrepot trade. After becoming a free port, Hong Kong rapidly became an important entrepot between the mainland and the world market. Foreign merchants imported Indian cotton and opium and British manufactured cotton goods and re-exported them to the mainland. At the same time, they bought Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain and re-exported them to India and Britain. Source 8.7 shows the badge of Hong Kong used in the early years of British rule. History in depth. The opium entrepot trade. Shortly after Hong Kong became a free port, British companies such as Jardine, Matheson & Co. and Dent & Co. set up bases along the north coast of Hong Kong Island for the opium entrepot trade. Opium was first imported into Hong Kong from India and later re-exported to the coastal regions of China. Opium was one of Hong Kong's major export items. According to official statistics, opium accounted for 86.5% of the value of Hong Kong's total exports in 1847. In 1913, China banned the import of opium. Hong Kong's opium entrepot trade then went into decline gradually. Source 8.8 shows a British overseer supervising his Indian workers packing opium in the 19th century. 2. Establishment of Hong Kong's position as entrepot. Many foreign firms set up bases in Hong Kong to engage in entrepot trade. Jardine, Matheson & Co., Dent & Co., and Butterfield and Swire Company are famous examples. Chinese trading companies such as Nam Pak Hong and Kam Shan Chong also emerged. Their business contributed greatly to the tax revenue of Hong Kong. Entrepot trade became the pillar of Hong Kong's economy. By the late 19th century, Hong Kong's foreign trade had been more internationalized. The share of re-exports from China to the United States and Australia increased daily, strengthening Hong Kong's position as an international entrepot. C. Entrepot trade promoting related industries. 1. Shipping industry. As East-West trade grew, many foreign shipping companies began to provide regular shipping services between Europe, the United States, the mainland, and Hong Kong. British companies such as Swire and Jardines also relocated their headquarters to Hong Kong to expand their shipping business in the region. The growth of entrepot trade and shipping industry further promoted the development of dockyards, wharves, and warehouses. Source 8.9 shows piers in Central in the early 20th century to the right, and the Hong Kong headquarters office of Dent & Co. in Central to the left. 2. Shipbuilding and ship repair industries. As many Chinese and foreign ocean-going ships docked in Hong Kong to get supplies and do repairs, the shipbuilding and ship repair industries developed. By 1867, Hong Kong already had 5 dockyards. The British-owned Hong Kong and Whampoa Dock Company was the largest in scale. 3. Banking industry. Foreign banks. In 1865, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Company Limited was founded. By then, there were 11 foreign banks in Hong Kong. Their major business was centered on entrepot trade, including provision of loans and foreign currency exchange to trading companies. Chinese Yin House. The Chinese yin house, such as the Shui Cat Yin Hao and Tin Fuk Yin Hao, were popular among Chinese merchants. As they had less capital compared to foreign banks, they mainly provided cash deposit and withdrawal and financing service in small scale. History Extra. Lion Bank. On March 3, 1865, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Company Limited was founded in Hong Kong. In 1881, it was renamed as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. 2 bronze lion statues named Stephen and Stitt have been placed outside its headquarters since 1935. Therefore, the bank is also known as the Lion Bank. During British rule, HSBC assumed a semi-central bank role. Today, it is still one of the note-issuing banks in Hong Kong. It is also a world-famous international bank, operating globally with branches throughout the world. Source 8.10 shows the headquarters office of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation in the 1880s. Complete the database question on page 215. D. Emergence of manufacturing industry. Hong Kong's manufacturing industry started in the 19th century. At first, there were mainly foreign factories. Chinese factories emerged in the 1880s to 1890s. They made various daily necessities such as soap, tobacco, and matches. These factories were small in scale and only had simple machines. Some of them even adopted the domestic system to make products. Source 8.11 shows matches made locally in the late 19th century. 2. Social development. Britain took over Hong Kong mainly for economic reasons. It did not pay much attention to the needs of local Chinese. However, as social conditions changed, Britain introduced a number of corresponding measures. A. Rapid population growth. Hong Kong's population increased from about 10,000 in 1841 to about 370,000 in 1898. The growth was largely driven by the influx of people. Most of them were from the mainland. The mid-19th century China was affected by wars and famines, while Hong Kong was experiencing economic growth. This encouraged more people from the mainland to move to Hong Kong. In addition, Europeans, Americans, and other ethnic minorities also came to work and trade in Hong Kong. Europeans and Americans worked as employees of Western companies and civil servants, while Indians and Southeast Asians worked as policemen. A multi-ethnic society gradually developed in Hong Kong. Source 8.12 shows foreign civil servants and their wives in Hong Kong in the late 19th century. B. Poor public hygiene. Rapid population growth led to overcrowded housing and worsening public hygiene. The problems were particularly serious in Taiping Shan area, where most local Chinese lived. The government had introduced sanitary regulations, but did not enforce them properly. The setting up of the Sanitary Board in 1883 failed to solve hygiene problems. In 1894, a serious bubonic plague broke out in Taiping Shan area. The government therefore carried out large-scale disinfection of the area. Afterwards, it started to deal with the problems of water supply and drainage in Chinese residential areas. It also ordered Chinese families to disinfect their homes twice a year. It was only after years that the bubonic plagues came under control and public hygiene improved. Source 8.13 demonstrates that disinfecting Taiping Shan area in 1894 was called Operation Taiping Tay. It was an important sanitary measure of the Sanitary Board, aiming to stop the spread of the plague. As comics say. Main points of the comics. What problems did the comics reveal about the Hong Kong government's handling of the 1894 bubonic plague? The 1894 bubonic plague. 1. In May 1894, a serious bubonic plague broke out and spread rapidly in Taiping Shan area, where most local Chinese lived. 2. The Hong Kong government carried out a door-to-door search for plague patients and disinfected their homes without consultation. 3. Moreover, the government ordered all plague patients to be taken to a floating hospital. They were isolated for treatment. 4. These measures caused panic and resentment among local Chinese. They also questioned the effectiveness of the quarantine measure. 5. Chinese leaders expressed the views of their people to the government. However, Governor Robinson turned a deaf ear. 6. Because of distrust and resentment, many local Chinese concealed their illness. The uncontrolled plague became endemic. It did not end until the 1920s. C. Problems of law and order. 1. Background. As opium trade and gambling were illegal in Hong Kong, coupled with rapid population growth and a lack of border control, serious problems of opium smoking, gambling, and abduction resulted. Pirates along the coast also threatened the safety of merchant ships and coastal inhabitants. 2. Measures. To maintain law and order, the Hong Kong government adopted the following measures. Set up the Hong Kong Police Force in 1844, enforced a curfew on local Chinese between 1842 and 1897, i.e., they must not be out of doors during specified hours at night without a pass. Set up the District Watch Force in 1866, banned gambling in 1872, and the British Royal Navy and the Chinese Navy cooperated to get rid of pirates around the seas of southern China after 1847. Source 8.14 shows local Chinese gambling in the mid-19th century. History Extra. No outdoor activities at night. To cope with the high crime rate, the Hong Kong government imposed a curfew on local Chinese in 1843. They must carry a lantern after 8 p.m. and a pass after 10 p.m. if they were out of doors. The details of the regulations had changed over time. For instance, according to the new ordinance promulgated in 1857, any Chinese found out of doors between 8 p.m. and sunrise and not having a pass would be punished by a fine, imprisonment, or public whipping. Night curfew was finally revoked in 1897. D. High-handed policies towards ordinary Chinese. 1. Background. British regarded local Chinese as the source of poor public hygiene and crime. They also aimed to maintain their privileged position. Therefore, they had many discriminatory measures against local Chinese. 2. Implementing strict supervisory control. Chinese were not allowed to hold or take part in any public meetings without the governor's permission. Besides, the police had the power to search their homes at any time and arrest suspicious people. Since 1891, the Secretary for Chinese Affairs became the chairman of the District Watch Force so as to supervise the Chinese directly. 3. Introducing discriminatory measures. Restricted political participation. In early years, all important government officials were foreigners. Chinese were unable to take part in important government decision-making. Harsh penalty. The court adopted a double standard in handling charges. Europeans were always protected or lightly punished. Chinese faced harsh penalty and were even lashed. Segregation of Chinese and foreigners. Britain passed the European District Reservation Ordinance in 1888, which reserved certain districts as residential areas for Europeans. There were also regulations on Chinese entry to public places. Source 8.15 indicates that in the late 19th century, Chinese-style houses were prohibited in the mid-levels area. As shown in the view of the Victoria Harbour at the time, below, only European-style houses were found in that area, shown on the left. In the early 20th century, Chinese were not even permitted to live in the Peak District. Source 8.16 shows the remarks of Governor Davis in March 1845, shown above, and Indian policemen and Chinese criminals wearing heavy yoke in the late 19th century, shown below. From the source. Study Source 8.16. What did Davis expect if Chinese criminals received Chinese punishments? E. Policy of winning over Chinese elites. 1. Background. Rise of Chinese elites and leaders. By the late 19th century, local Chinese merchants and compradors became rich, while a few Chinese became professionals after receiving higher education. Some of these Chinese elites were actively involved in social affairs and became leaders of the Chinese, such as the founders of Tonghua Hospital, Kwok Kam Cheung and Ko Mun Hua. 2. Policy. Cooperation with Chinese elites and leaders. To rule efficiently, the Hong Kong government started to cooperate with influential Chinese elites and leaders. The government allowed Chinese elites to take part in politics. For example, Wu Tingfang was appointed as the first Chinese unofficial member of the Legislative Council in 1880. The government also appointed Chinese leaders as Justice of the Peace and members of the Sanitary Board. Chinese elites and leaders became the bridge between the government and local Chinese. Nevertheless, the social status of most Chinese was still low by the early 20th century. Source 8.17 indicates that Wu Tingfang, better known in Hong Kong as Ng Choi, was Hong Kong's first barrister. History in depth. Chinese merchants and compradors. By the mid-19th century, many local Chinese merchants earned huge profits from entrepot trade. Some Chinese compradors, who could speak English and acted as middlemen for foreign merchants trading in China, became rich as well. Ho Tung and Ho Kam Tong were the most well-known compradors. Local Chinese businessmen and compradors also invested in local manufacturing industries, construction, real estate, etc. Their increasing wealth made them become, to the government, the new force that could not be ignored. Source 8.18 shows Ho Kam Tong, a former comprador of Jardines. He became a wealthy businessman by investing in other different industries. Please answer the data-based question on page 223. F. Education policy. 1. Background. Government ignored education development. In the early years of British rule, the Hong Kong government rarely allocated resources to education. Most schools in Hong Kong were traditional Chinese private schools or Western church schools. 2. Policy. Start of public education. In 1848, the government started to transform some private schools into government schools. Public education in Hong Kong began. In 1860, the Board of Education was set up to take charge of education policies. Since then, the government built more government schools and provided subsidies to private education organizations. Education became more popular. In 1862, the first government secondary school, Central School, was established. In 1878, English was made a compulsory subject in all government schools and became the main medium of instruction in Hong Kong. 1860. Established the Board of Education to take charge of education policy. 1862. Set up the first government secondary school, Central School, present-day Queen's College. 1873. Started to subsidize private organizations and religious bodies in building schools. 1878. English was made a compulsory subject in all government schools. 1890. Set up the first government girls' school, Central School for Girls, present-day Belilios Public School. Source 8.19 shows the development of Hong Kong's education policy on the right and Queen's College in the early 20th century, shown below. G. Urban and infrastructure development. 1. Background. Needs of economic and social developments. Owing to the rapid economic and population growth, there was an ever-increasing demand for land. Improvements on transportation and public utilities were also needed to meet the urban growth. 2. Development. Land reclamation and development of public utilities. From 1850s onwards, the government reclaimed land along the north coast of Hong Kong Island and the coast of Kowloon Peninsula. The projects increased land for economic activities, building roads, houses, and public facilities. More roads were built to connect different districts, for example, Daewoo Road and Salisbury Road. In addition, peak trams and ferries commenced services. Energy, water, and telecommunication services were also provided to the public. These services improved the infrastructure in Kowloon and Hong Kong Island. Urban and infrastructure development of Hong Kong Island in the 19th century. In 1851, land reclamation began along the north coast of Hong Kong Island. In 1862, Hong Kong and China Gas Company Limited started to provide coal gas for lighting and cooking. In 1863, Pok Fu Lam Reservoir was built to store drinking water. In 1871, Eastern Telegraph Company started to provide telegraph services. In 1882, Oriental Telephone and Electric Company was set up to provide telephone services. In 1888, the Peak tram service between the Peak and Central started. In 1889, Hong Kong Electric Company was set up to provide electricity. In 1898, Kowloon Ferry Company, present-day Star Ferry Company Limited, started to provide regular ferry services between Central and Tsim Sha Tsui. C. Contributions of non-governmental organizations to Hong Kong. Guiding question. What contributions did non-governmental organizations make to Hong Kong in the mid and late 19th century? 1. Local Chinese organizations. As government expenditure on social welfare was very limited, different Chinese organizations were set up to provide various social services for local Chinese. A. The Tung Wah Hospital. 1. Background to the establishment. Western medical services were introduced in the mid-19th century, but they were mainly offered to Europeans. Most Chinese rejected Western medicine, and hospitals charged high prices. As a result, many dying Chinese gathered in the Kwong Fuk Yi Zi on Taiping Shan Street. 2. Development and contributions. In 1869, the governor finally agreed to the construction of a Chinese hospital. The Tung Wah Hospital, meaning Hospital of the Cantonese, was funded by a group of Chinese leaders and the government in 1870. It provided free Chinese medication for the poor, and all its expenses were borne by those Chinese leaders. Tung Wah Hospital also provided other services such as burial, education, and elderly services. It became a large organization that mainly served the Chinese and promoted the development of Hong Kong's social welfare. Moreover, It reflected the opinions of local Chinese to the government, which helped increase the government's understanding of the Chinese society. Source 8.20 shows the logo of the Tonghua Group of Hospitals, pictured above. In 1931, the Tonghua Hospital, the Kwonghua Hospital, and the Tonghua Eastern Hospital joined together to form the Tonghua Group of Hospitals. The former lobby of Kwonghua Hospital, shown below, is now the Tonghua Museum. History headline: Providing relief to victims as if they were family. Imperial plaque awarded to Tonghua. February 21st, 1885. Raising funds for victims in the mainland. Tonghua Hospital served not only local Chinese, but also mainland and overseas Chinese. For example, during the serious drought in northern China in the 1870s, Tonghua Hospital actively raised funds for the victims. Emperor Guangxu awarded a plaque to the hospital to honor its contributions. Second plaque from the Emperor. In 1885, serious floods devastated Guangdong and Guangxi. Tonghua Hospital raised funds again and was supported by local and overseas Chinese merchants. On February 21st, 1885, Emperor Guangxu awarded another plaque with the words that meant all things benefited from benevolent deeds to Tonghua Hospital. The awards enhanced the reputation of the hospital among the vast Chinese population in Hong Kong. B. Po Leung Kuk. 1. Background to the establishment. By the mid-19th century, crimes of abduction and trafficking of women and children were getting serious in Hong Kong. Many young women were abducted and sold as maids, known as mui zai, or even prostitutes. 2. Development and contributions. In 1878, a group of local Chinese petitioned the governor to set up an organization to rescue the kidnapped victims. In 1882, Po Leung Kuk was officially established. Po Leung Kuk worked to prevent abduction and save abducted women and children. It also provided shelter to victims and then helped them find jobs, get married, or return home. It also assisted the Secretary for Chinese Affairs in settling family and marriage disputes amongst the Chinese population. The work of Po Leung Kuk greatly helped in maintaining and promoting the stability of Hong Kong. Source 8.21 shows the logo of Po Leung Kuk. Source 8.22 shows the opening ceremony of Po Leung Kuk's new building in 1896 to the right, and present-day Po Leung Kuk on Leighton Road, Causeway Bay, shown below. C. The Lok Sin Tong Benevolent Society, Kowloon. 1. Background to the establishment. In the second half of the 19th century, a common scale was placed at the market near a pier in Kowloon Walled City. People had to weigh their goods before transactions and pay a fee for the service. The collected money was used for charitable purposes, including provision of medication and burial services. 2. Development and contributions. In 1880, the Lok Sin Tong Benevolent Society, Kowloon, was officially established to manage the charitable funds. With the outbreak of epidemics in the late 19th century, Lok Sin Tong set up a free graveyard to bury unclaimed dead bodies. Its work helped to maintain social stability and improve public hygiene. D. District Watch Force. 1. Background to the establishment. The early Hong Kong police force had limited manpower and was inefficient. The Chinese formed their own security force to maintain law and order. 2. Development and contributions. With the support of the government, a group of Chinese merchants set up the District Watch Force for security purpose in 1866. Later, The organization also took part in conducting population census and became an advisory organization to the government on Chinese affairs. It was crucial in helping the government maintain social stability and govern the Chinese. Source 8.23 shows the logo of the Lok Sin Tong Benevolent Society, Kowloon. Source 8.24 shows Wei Yuk, a famous Chinese leader in the late 19th century. When he served as a committee member of the District Watch Force, the organization developed significantly. 2. Foreign religious organizations. Many foreign missionaries and Christian organizations came to Hong Kong in the early years of British rule. Besides missionary work, they also provided and developed social services to improve the livelihoods of the local people. A. Taking care of orphans and disabled people. In the 19th century, foreign Christian organizations such as the Canossian Daughters of Charity set up orphanages in Hong Kong. They looked after abandoned children and gave them basic education. Later, some of these orphanages became primary and secondary schools. Some foreign Christian organizations helped disabled people. For example, present-day Ebenezer School and Home for the Visually Impaired was founded in 1897 by Hildesheimer Blindenmission, Germany as a home for blind girls. Source 8.25 is a picture of students at a Christian school during the early years of Hong Kong, shown above, and Bishop's House of the Hong Kong Shin Kong Hui, built in 1848, shown on the right. It was used as the campus of St. Paul's College until the mid-20th century. B. Providing education. Foreign Christian organizations founded many schools in Hong Kong, such as Yinghua College, relocated from Malacca to Hong Kong in 1843, of the London Missionary Society, and St. Paul's College, set up in 1851, of Anglican Church. Chinese, English, and theology were taught. This contributed to the spread of Western and English language education in early Hong Kong. Some foreign missionaries also took part in the education affairs of the government. For example, British missionary James Legge joined the Board of Education and proposed the founding of the Central School. He contributed to promoting the development of public education in Hong Kong. C. Founding hospitals. Foreign Christian organizations preached through medical services. For example, in 1887, the London Missionary Society built the Alice Memorial Hospital, present-day Alice Ho Miu Ling Nethersole Hospital, to provide Western medical services for local Chinese. It was also a teaching hospital, providing training to Chinese medical students. Source 8.26 is a photograph of doctors and staff of the Alice Memorial Hospital in the late 19th century, shown above, and the present-day Alice Ho Miu Ling Nethersole Hospital, shown on the right. History extended. Contributions of Europeans, Americans, and other ethnic minorities to Hong Kong. Part 1. Portuguese and Hong Kong. The Portuguese were the earliest European ethnic group to move to Hong Kong after the British. They lived and traded in Macau before. Some were fluent in Cantonese and served as a bridge between British officials and traders and local Chinese. In the late 19th century, Braga, a Portuguese, proposed to build a garden city in Kowloon Tong. This paved the way for Kowloon Tong to develop into a low-density, high-class residential district. In addition, as most Portuguese were Catholics, they funded the building of many early Catholic churches and schools, such as present-day St. Joseph's College. Americans and Hong Kong. The Americans in 19th century Hong Kong mostly contributed to the development of the Protestant Church. The Baptist missionary Reverend Shuck and his wife preached through education and medical services. The Henrietta Secondary School is named after his wife to commend her contributions. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American dentist Joseph Noble also made different contributions to Hong Kong. He helped organize the Hong Kong College of Medicine for Chinese and invested in public utility companies such as the Peak Tramways Company Limited and the Hong Kong Electric Company. Source 8.27 shows that Joseph Noble and the Sassoon family were the main investors of the Peak Tramways Company Limited, founded in 1888. Parsis and Hong Kong. A group of Parsi traders moved from Guangdong to Hong Kong in the early years of British rule. They once set up many foreign firms in Hong Kong. Mithawala and Modi were the two famous Parsi merchants in Hong Kong. In 1880, Mithawala's Kowloon Ferry Company started to provide ferry service across Victoria Harbour. It was a milestone in the development of Hong Kong's public sea transport. In the early 20th century, Modi made a major donation towards the founding of Hong Kong's first university, the University of Hong Kong. He helped promote the development of Hong Kong's higher education. Jews and Hong Kong. During the second half of the 19th century, many Jewish leaders invested in Hong Kong. The Sassoon family, the Berlioz family, and the Kadoorie family were representatives. The Kadoorie family invested in electricity business, bought the shares of China Light and Power Company Syndicate to provide electricity in Kowloon. This met the increasing needs for electricity supply and laid the foundation for Hong Kong's industrialization in the mid-20th century. Source 8.28 is a picture of Modi. The University of Hong Kong praised him as a prominent Parsi businessman and a famous philanthropist. Source 8.29 shows that the Kadoorie family supported Hong Kong's agricultural development. They built farms and taught farmers profitable farming methods. History extended. Contributions of Europeans, Americans, and other ethnic minorities to Hong Kong. Part 2. Eurasians and Hong Kong. In the early years, European men came to Hong Kong alone and married local Chinese women. Their children were the first-generation Eurasians. A few of them were fluent in Chinese and foreign languages, and were active in politics and trade. Ho Tung was a famous Eurasian of Dutch and Chinese descent. He was a comprador in his early career. Later, he became a successful entrepreneur and invested in sugar, transportation, and real estate. In 1899, Ho Tung was appointed Justice of the Peace for his social contributions. He set up the Sir Robert Ho Tung Charitable Fund before his death. Today, many charitable and educational organizations still benefit from this fund. Armenians and Hong Kong. There were very few Armenians in Hong Kong in the 19th century. Most Armenians were traders. Some of them were also jurors and unofficial members, and had a certain social status in Hong Kong. Paul Chater was a very accomplished Armenian in Hong Kong at that time. He was a rich businessman and an unofficial member of the Legislative Council and Executive Council. In 1891, Chater promoted setting up the first stock exchange in Hong Kong, the Stockbrokers Association of Hong Kong. It marked the birth of the stock market in Hong Kong and had great influence on the development of the territory's financial industries. Source 8.30 shows that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Ho Tung and his family had great political and economic influence in Hong Kong. Source 8.31 shows that Paul Chater founded many famous companies in the territory, such as Hong Kong Land and Dairy Farm.